Michael's shovel struck the hardened ground with dry, rhythmic blows, each movement accompanied by a silent prayer that rose to the heavens along with the red dust of Kentucky. The sweat dripped down his sunburned face as he desperately dug next to the artesian well that had dried up 3 weeks earlier, searching for any trace of water he could use to prepare the homemade remedy that Mrs. Margaret had suggested to Sarah. Rex, her faithful 15-year-old dog, was sniffing restlessly around the increasingly deep hole, as if sensing that something beyond water was hidden in that parched earth. When the shovel finally met resistance, Michael thought he had hit a large rock, but when he cleared the dirt with his calloused hands, his fingers touched something that made his heart race. It was a corroded metal pipe, partially buried, connected to a system that clearly did not belong to that place. Following the pipe with growing curiosity and apprehension, he discovered that it extended toward the Appalachian Mountains, disappearing beneath rocks and centuries-old roots, like a secret buried by time. The small village of Millbrook, nestled in the forgotten valleys of the Kentucky mountains, had witnessed the gradual decline of its fertile lands over the past 20 years. Michael Thompson, a descendant of 3 generations of farmers, religiously woke up at 4 in the morning to tend to the 3 cows that remained of a herd that once counted 40 heads. His calloused hands, worn from daily toil, trembled not only from the morning chill, but from the constant anguish of seeing Sarah, his companion of 22 years, withering in her bed like a flower deprived of water under the scorching summer sun. The mysterious illness that consumed Sarah had started as an inexplicable fatigue, evolving into a weakness that prevented her from getting out of bed. The doctors in Louisville, 3 hours away on a dusty road, had exhausted all possible diagnoses, blood tests, x-rays, MRIs, spending the family's savings without offering even a glimmer of hope. The nights became long vigils where Michael held Sarah's cold hand, whispering desperate prayers to a God who seemed to have forgotten that hard-working family. It was during one of those anguished dawns that Mrs. Margaret knocked on the door of the simple wooden house. The respected village healer, a woman with grey hair and piercing eyes who carried with her the ancestral knowledge of plants and natural remedies, brought with her a recipe that required pure water from a specific spring. "There is a sacred spring in the mountains, Michael," she said, her voice laden with conviction and mystery. "Many have been healed by those waters, but it takes true faith and courage to seek them." The discovery of the buried pipeline on his property sparked a curiosity that Michael couldn't ignore. Following the corroded pipes through his land, he discovered that they extended toward the same mountains where Mrs. Margaret had said that the sacred spring existed. It was as if fate had placed that clue in his path, a sign that he should follow that mysterious trail wherever it might lead him. On a cold Friday dawn, when the stars still shone in the dark Kentucky sky, Michael prepared for the journey that would change his life forever. Armed only with an old lantern whose yellowish beam precariously cut through the darkness, a few empty plastic jugs tied to his battered backpack, and following both the vague directions of Mrs. Margaret and the traces of the pipeline he had found, he set off along the abandoned trails that wound through the dense forest of the Appalachian Mountains. The pipe system guided him like an underground map, occasionally appearing among the rocks and disappearing again beneath the dense vegetation. The forest seemed alive and watchful around Michael as he walked through the forgotten paths. Dry branches cracked under his feet, echoing like brittle bones in the stillness of dawn. The damp smell of decaying leaves mingled with the resinous aroma of the century-old pines, creating a dense atmosphere that seemed to embrace the desperate farmer like an ancestral cloak. At each bend of the trail, the corroded pipe reappeared among the stones, confirming that he was on the right path toward his mysterious destination. After 3 hours of exhausting walking, following the traces of the piping system that sometimes appeared on the surface and sometimes disappeared under rocks and roots, Michael finally spotted the entrance to the cave that Mrs. Margaret had described. A narrow crack in the rocky face of the mountain, almost imperceptible among the giant ferns that grew around, as if nature were trying deliberately hide that portal to an underground world. The sound of flowing water echoed from the dark depths, an ancient whisper that seemed to call the farmer into the womb of the earth. The descent into the cave proved to be more challenging than Michael had imagined. The low ceiling forced him to walk bent over, and his boots constantly slipped on the moss-covered stones that formed the uneven floor. The light from his lantern created ghostly shadows on the damp walls, where rock formations seemed sculpted by divine hands over thousands of years. The pipeline he had followed through the forest continued inside the cave, now clearly visible and connected to a more complex system that had been built decades earlier. When he finally found the source, Michael felt his heart race like that of a frightened horse. What lay before his eyes confirmed his most disturbing suspicions. It was not just a natural spring bubbling from the rocks, as he had expected based on the healer's poetic descriptions, but clearly the endpoint of an abandoned industrial system. Partially corroded metal pipes emerged from the cave walls, connected to the same system he had discovered on his property, creating a complex network that revealed decades of human activity in that supposedly pristine environment. Even more disturbing was the liquid gushing from those rusty pipes. Although it was translucent like pure water, it had a faintly greenish glow that seemed to pulse in the darkness of the cave, as if it had a life of its own. The substance emitted an almost imperceptible odor, a strange combination of metal and something chemical that Michael couldn't identify. Even so, driven by the despair that had corroded his soul for months and the image of Sarah withering in her bed, he filled the jugs with that mysterious water, whispering a silent prayer that it would truly be the cure his family so desperately needed. The journey back home was a trip intertwined with anxiety and hope. Michael walked faster than on the way there, driven by the urgency of bringing that possible salvation to Sarah before it was too late. The heavy jugs in his backpack made his shoulders ache, but he barely felt the physical discomfort in the face of the possibility of seeing his wife regain the health and vitality she had lost. With each step he took toward his house, he mentally constructed the moment he would offer that water to Sarah, imagining the relief and gratitude they would see in each other's eyes. Sarah was awake when Michael got home, her pale hands gripping tightly the tattered blanket that covered her up to her neck. Her eyes, which once were vibrant like emeralds, now seemed like dull glass, reflecting a distant and melancholic light. When Michael told her about the discovery of the pipe on their property, the trail he had followed to the cave, and the water he had found, she didn't hesitate for even a second. With a blind trust in the love and care of the husband, who had been her anchor for more than 2 decades, she drank the translucent liquid without asking questions, swallowing sip after sip as if she were drinking her own life back. The result was so quick and seemingly miraculous that it left Michael momentarily speechless. In just 3 days, Sarah regained the rosy color in her cheeks, returned to eating with the appetite of her youth, and displayed an energy she hadn't shown in months. She got out of bed, walked around the house, helped with household chores, and even went out to feed the chickens in the yard, humming a melody that Michael had forgotten to hear. It was as if the wife he knew and loved had come back from the dead, resurrected by that mysterious substance he had sought in the depths of the mountain. Sarah's transformation did not go unnoticed by the neighbors of Millbrook. The news of her miraculous recovery spread through the village like wildfire during the dry season, traveling from house to house, through the curious whispers of women who met at the local market and the conversations of men who gathered at the blacksmith's shop. Within days, a line of desperate people began to form at the door of Michael's humble home, individuals who had heard about the extraordinary cure and begged to know where he had found that miraculous salvation. Among the visitors were entire families, whose loved ones suffered from ailments that conventional medicine could not cure. There were children with rare diseases, elderly people consumed by arthritis and rheumatism, young adults who had lost their vitality due to mysterious conditions similar to the one that had afflicted Sarah. They all arrived at Michael's house with eyes loaded with hope and despair, carrying with them the same anguish he had felt during the dark months of Sarah's illness. Michael found himself torn between the desire to keep the sources secret, to protect both the place and his family, and the genuine compassion he felt for the suffering of those people. They were his neighbors, people who had been kind to him and Sarah over the years, families who had shared harvests in times of plenty and offered help during difficult periods. How could he deny them the same opportunity for healing that had saved his wife? Reluctant, but moved by the suffering of others that he recognized in their own broken hearts, he decided to share the secret of the mysterious cave. With careful instructions and rudimentary maps drawn on brown paper, Michael guided the first families to the cave hidden in the mountains. He explained in detail the path through the abandoned trails, how to identify the remnants of the pipeline that would serve as a guide, warned about the difficulties of descending into the cave, and described exactly where to find the source of the mysterious water. Each family that followed his guidance returned days later with extraordinary stories of immediate improvements and transformations that seemed to defy all the laws of medicine and logic. In 2 weeks, more than 30 people from the village of Millbrook had drunk from the secret spring, and all without exception reported extraordinary improvements in their health conditions. Old people who could barely walk felt young again, moving with agility they hadn't shown in decades. Sickly children who spent their days bedridden ran through the fields with renewed vigor, their laughter echoing through the valleys like celestial music. Robert Sullivan, the blacksmith who had suffered from arthritis for a decade and could barely hold a hammer, returned to work with the strength and skill of his youth. Michael became a revered figure in Millbrook, a kind of local hero who had discovered the fountain of life and generously shared it with his community. Entire families came to his door with simple gifts but filled with gratitude. Baskets of fresh fruit, homemade bread still warm from the oven, artisanal preserves, hand-stitched quilts made by the village women. Children ran after him down the dirt streets, considering him an almost mythical figure who had brought healing to their families. Adult men would take off their hats in a sign of respect when they encountered him, and women would whisper blessings in his name during evening prayers. However, this atmosphere of celebration and gratitude would not last long. Professor William Morgan, the only genuinely educated man in Millbrook who had studied chemistry and biology in Chicago before returning to his hometown to teach at the small local school, began to show increasing concern as he observed the effects of the miracle water on his neighbors. His academic background and scientific knowledge led him to question the nature of that substance that produced such extraordinary and immediate results. William had noticed that the water had physical and chemical characteristics too strange to be a common natural source. The slightly greenish color, the peculiar glow that some swore they saw in the dark, the subtle but distinctive odor that emanated from the liquid, all these elements aroused his scientific suspicion. Even more concerning was the speed with which people showed improvements, a rapidity that defied everything he knew about natural healing processes and the organic recovery of the human body. Moreover, when Michael told him about the discovery of the industrial pipeline on his property, all of the professor's suspicions intensified dramatically. Determined to uncover the truth about that substance that had transformed the lives of the entire village, Professor William decided to act secretly. With extreme care to avoid raising suspicions, he collected a sample of the mysterious water and stored it in a sterilized vial he had acquired for his school experiments. Spending his own modest savings as a teacher, money he had set aside to buy new books for the school library, he traveled to Louisville and delivered the sample for analysis at a laboratory specializing in industrial chemistry and toxicology. The wait for the results was a period of growing anxiety for William. For 2 weeks, he watched his neighbors continue drinking from the miraculous fountain, seeing their expressions of happiness and gratitude, while an increasingly intense worry grew in his heart. His scientific knowledge alerted him to the possibility that those seemingly beneficial effects could mask something much more sinister and dangerous. Experience had taught him that in nature, miraculous cures are rarely without consequences, and that substances producing such dramatic effects often carry proportionally severe risks. When the results finally arrived, William felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. The laboratory report revealed a terrifying truth. The substance analyzed was a highly toxic cocktail composed of heavy metals in dangerous concentrations, including lead, mercury, and arsenic, as well as a variety of industrial chemical compounds that should not be present in any natural water source. The seemingly miraculous liquid was, in reality, the result of decades of improper disposal of industrial waste by a company that had operated in the region and then disappeared without a trace or taking responsibility. The professor ran desperately to Michael's house, arriving breathless and with the report trembling in his hands. With the urgency of someone carrying news that could save lives, he explained in detail the results of the analysis, clarifying that the initial effects of improvement that everyone was experiencing were a dangerous illusion caused by the artificial chemical stimulation of the nervous system and other vital organs. The feeling of energy and vitality was temporary and deceptive, similar to the effects of stimulant drugs that mask symptoms without addressing the real causes of illnesses. Even worse was the revelation that, in the long term, that substance would cause irreversible damage to vital organs especially the liver and kidneys, which would be gradually destroyed by the accumulation of toxins in the body. The professor explained that the more people drank that poisoned water, the more addicted they would become to the temporary effects of well-being, creating a lethal cycle of chemical dependency that would inexorably lead them to death by chronic poisoning. Each sip they had taken was, in fact, bringing them closer to a tragic fate they had not yet realized. Michael felt the world crumble around him when he fully understood the implications of the professor's words. In his desperate and well-intentioned quest for a cure for Sarah, following both the healer's guidance and the clues he had found on his own property, he had inadvertently poisoned not only his beloved wife, but also dozens of innocent people who had trusted him as if he were a divine messenger. The water that had seemed a blessing from the heavens now revealed itself as a terrible curse that he had spread throughout his entire community. The weight of this responsibility fell upon his shoulders like a mountain, crushing his soul with a guilt that seemed unbearable. The situation drastically complicated when, the morning after the professor's revelation, two men in dark suits appeared in the village driving a black sedan with license plates from another state. They introduced themselves as legal representatives of an environmental risk management company, claiming to be there to resolve a delicate situation related to the discovery of the contaminated source. Their smiles were calculated and cold, their handshakes too firm, and something in their eyes suggested they were not just there to discuss legal matters. The men sought out Michael on his property, appearing at the door of his simple house like black crows against the blue Kentucky sky. With a professional courtesy that barely masked underlying threats, they explained that they represented the interests of the company that had originally disposed of the chemical waste in the area decades earlier. The pipeline that Michael had discovered on his land was part of a clandestine disposal system that the company had installed to avoid the costs of properly disposing of their toxic waste. They offered a substantial sum of money in exchange for Michael's silence about the discovery of the contaminated source, an amount that represented more money than the farmer would see in his entire life of honest work on the land. It was a proposal tempting beyond imagination. With that money, Michael could pay for the best medical treatments available for Sarah, take her to the most renowned hospitals in the country, hire internationally renowned specialists. They could leave behind the life of financial difficulties, move to a big city where they would have access to all the resources that a comfortable life could offer. All he needed to do was convince Professor William to destroy the laboratory reports he had obtained and discreetly guide the villagers to stop searching for the mysterious source. "Think of your wife, Mr. Thompson," said one of the men, his voice smooth as silk but laden with dangerous insinuations. "She needs to adequate medical care, right? And think of yourself. You have worked hard your entire life and deserve a bit of comfort in the years you have ahead. Wouldn't it be unwise to waste this unique opportunity due to unnecessary scruples about situations that are beyond your control? After all, you didn't create this problem. You just discovered it." For 3 consecutive nights, Michael couldn't close his eyes. He walked through the house like a tormented ghost, spending hours sitting by the bed where Sarah slept, watching her regular breathing and remembering how close he had come to losing her. His mind was a battlefield where 2 conflicting impulses fought for supremacy: the desperate love for his wife and the understandable desire to secure a safe future for both of them, against the moral responsibility he felt toward the dozens of people who had trusted him and were now unknowingly walking toward lethal poisoning. Sarah, still under the temporary effects of the toxic substance that gave her artificial energy and an appearance of health that masked the deterioration process occurring in her body, implored Michael to accept the offer from the men in suits. "We have suffered so much, my love," she whispered during the long nighttime conversations. "We have worked so hard and have never had anything but difficulties. God is giving us an opportunity for prosperity. We can't waste it because of scruples that won't feed us or pay our bills. These people made their own choices by drinking from the source." On the other side of the moral equation, Michael saw in the urgent and worried eyes of Professor William the responsibility that weighed on his shoulders. The educated man had risked his own savings to uncover the truth, driven not by personal interests, but by a genuine concern for the well-being of the entire community. Each passing day was another day in which dozens of people continued to poison themselves, sincerely believing they were being healed, placing blind trust in the man who had discovered the miraculous spring. The psychological pressure increased considerably when the men in suits began making regular visits to the village, always with polite smiles, but carrying an aura of threat that did not go unnoticed by the local residents. They subtly suggested that accidents could happen to people who did not understand the importance of keeping certain information secret. They casually mentioned how dangerous it was to live in such an isolated area, where help could take a long time to arrive in case of emergencies, and how regrettable it would be if something happened to loved ones because of reckless decisions. "Understand, Mr. Thompson," one of them said during one of their visits, "that there are greater forces at play here. Our company has the resources to make people's lives very comfortable or very difficult. We naturally prefer the first option, but the choice is yours. Think carefully about the consequences of your decisions, not just for yourself, but for this entire community that depends on your discretion." The turning point in Michael's awareness came unexpectedly and devastatingly. During one of his melancholic walks through the dirt streets of the village, trying to find some peace for his tormented soul, he witnessed a scene that completely changed his perspective on the situation. There was Emma, the 8-year-old daughter of Mrs. Margaret, kneeling beside the well in the central square, carefully drinking from a small vial that contained the poisoned water her grandmother had fetched from the cave. The girl, with her blonde hair tied in braids and her blue eyes shining with innocent confidence, drank from that lethal substance, sincerely believing it would protect her from any future illness. She had heard the adults talking about the miraculous powers of water, and with the simple logic of a child, concluded that drinking from that source regularly would keep her always healthy and strong. As she swallowed the translucent liquid, she hummed a cheerful melody, completely unaware that she was slowly poisoning herself. "Aunt Margaret said this water is magical," Emma said to Michael when she noticed him watching. "She said that if I drink a little bit every day, I'll never get sick like the other kids." "Is it true, Mr. Michael? Does water really have special powers?" Her eyes sparkled with childlike curiosity, completely trusting in the goodness of the adults around her. In that devastating moment, seeing the absolute innocence of that child, and remembering all the neighbors who treated him like a savior sent by God, Michael felt a moral clarity that cut through all his doubts and internal conflicts. It didn't matter how much money the men in suits offered. It didn't matter how difficult his future life would be without that financial opportunity. It didn't even matter the personal risk he would run by challenging clearly dangerous people. He wouldn't be able to live with himself knowing that he had allowed an innocent child and dozens of other people to continue being poisoned because of his cowardly omission. The next dawn, when the stars still shone in the dark Kentucky sky, Michael knocked on the door of Professor Williams' simple house. The educator welcomed him immediately, recognizing in the farmer's expression the determination of someone who had made an irreversible decision. Together, around the wooden kitchen table illuminated only by an oil lamp, they devised a careful plan to expose the truth about the poisoned spring in such a way that no additional person would be harmed, even knowing that this would mean definitively renouncing the money offered by the men in suits and facing the unpredictable consequences of the threats they had received. The plan was simultaneously simple and risky. William would use his academic contacts in Louisville to alert public health authorities about the situation, providing all the laboratory documentation he had collected. Simultaneously, Michael would call a community meeting at the local church, where he would publicly reveal the truth about the toxic nature of the water everyone had been drinking. They knew they needed to act quickly, before the long-term effects of the contamination became irreversible for many of the affected people. The revelation caused an emotional earthquake in the small community of Millbrook. The meeting at the church, held on a rainy Thursday when the sound of raindrops hitting the metal roof punctuated Michael's anguished words, turned into an event that would forever be etched in the village's collective memory. Some people reacted with explosive anger, feeling betrayed and deceived by the man in whom they had placed absolute trust. Others, more reflective, gradually understood that Michael had also been a victim of desperate circumstances that led him to make decisions based on love and despair. "You don't understand," shouted Robert Sullivan, the blacksmith, his hands still trembling with anger and confusion. "I was dying of pain. I couldn't even hold a hammer. Now I feel young again. I work like in my best years. How can you say this is poison? Maybe the doctors are wrong. Maybe it's envy to see simple people find the cure they can't offer." Her voice echoed through the crowded church, expressing the emotional resistance of many people who could not accept that the positive effects they felt were a dangerous illusion masking a progressive poisoning. The psychological difficulty of abandoning a hope that had become the only light in their dark lives created an almost insurmountable barrier to accepting the scientific truth. On the other hand, Mrs. Margaret, with her wisdom accumulated over decades, caring for the community's health through traditional methods, was one of the first to accept the terrible truth. "I should have suspected," she murmured, her hands covering her face in an expression of deep sorrow. "A true cure doesn't come like this, so quick and miraculous. Nature heals slowly with patience. I was a fool to believe that there were shortcuts to true health, and worse still, I guided other people to that cursed source." The most painful thing for Michael was watching Sarah during the days that followed the public revelation. When she stopped consuming the toxic substance, following the urgent medical guidelines that arrived with the first public health teams sent by the state government, her health condition began to deteriorate again. The artificial energy that kept her active and seemingly healthy gradually disappeared, and she began to show the symptoms of weakness and fatigue that had characterized her original condition. However, this time the situation was different. Sarah would face her original illness with appropriate medical treatments based on real science, not chemical illusions that masked symptoms while causing even greater harm. Professor William, using his academic network, had managed to organize a campaign with charities in Chicago and Louisville to fund specialized treatments for all the people affected by the contamination, including Sarah. Toxicology specialists arrived in the village to assess each case individually and develop personalized detoxification protocols. "Forgive me, Sarah," Michael whispered during one of the long nights by his wife's bedside. "I thought I was saving you, but I killed with my own hands." His tears fell onto Sarah's pale hands, carrying with them all the anguish of a man who had discovered that his best intentions had turned into almost fatal actions. Sarah, with an emotional maturity forged by suffering, weakly squeezed her husband's hand. "You did what anyone who loves would do, Michael. You can't blame yourself for trying to save those you love. The important thing is that now we are doing the right thing, even if it is harder than accepting comfortable lies." The men in suits disappeared from Millbrook as suddenly as they had appeared, as soon as they realized they could not silence the truth through bribery or intimidation. They left behind only the certainty that the legal battle was far from over. Federal investigators arrived in the village to document the extent of environmental contamination and trace corporate responsibilities that spanned decades of negligence and abandonment. The cave was sealed by environmental authorities, and a comprehensive community health monitoring program was implemented to track the long-term effects of exposure to toxic chemicals. Michael knew he would face years of lawsuits, complex investigations, and likely legal pressures from companies that would prefer to keep their environmental crimes buried, along with their toxic waste. Environmental law specialists arrived to represent the community in class actions against the responsible corporations, but the legal path would be long and uncertain. However, for the first time in months, Michael was able to sleep peacefully, even if briefly, knowing that he had chosen to protect his community instead of his own immediate financial interests. The transformation in the social dynamics of Millbrook was profound and lasting. Some families, initially furious with Michael for destroying their hope of a miraculous cure, gradually came to recognize the moral courage that had been necessary for him to renounce an opportunity for enrichment in favor of the truth. Others remained resentful, blaming him both for the initial poisoning and the subsequent revelation, unable to accept the complexity of a situation where there were no simple villains or easy solutions. Professor William emerged as a respected leadership figure in the community. His dedication to scientific truth and his personal financial sacrifice to uncover the facts being recognized as acts of genuine heroism. He established an educational program at the local school to teach children about the dangers of environmental pollution and the importance of critical thinking when evaluating claims about miraculous cures. His classroom became a center for discussion on corporate responsibility and environmental citizenship, Mrs. Margaret, bearing the weight of guilt for inadvertently directing Michael to the poisoned source, dedicated herself with renewed intensity to the study of traditional healing methods based on genuinely medicinal plants. She established a community botanical garden where she cultivated herbs with proven therapeutic properties, offering her ancestral knowledge in a more careful and responsible manner, always in collaboration with modern medicine, never in opposition to it. "I learned that ancient wisdom must walk hand in hand with new knowledge," she would say to anyone who would listen. "Not in opposition, but in harmony." Months later, while caring for Sarah during her real treatment for the original disease that had caused the entire crisis, Michael found moments of silent reflection on everything that had happened. Sitting by the bed where his wife rested, no longer under the influence of artificial chemical stimulants, but receiving medical care based on precise diagnoses and scientifically validated treatments, he contemplated the painful lessons the experience had taught the entire community. The discovery of the pipeline on his property, which had initially seemed like a divine sign directing him to Sarah's salvation, had revealed itself to be part of a system of environmental crimes that had put his entire community at risk. It was a bitter lesson about how even the best intentions can lead us down dangerous paths when we don't have all the necessary information to make truly informed decisions. Sarah, in turn, had developed a mature perspective on her own medical condition and the role she had played in the community crisis. Although she initially resisted Michael's decision to reveal the truth about the poisoned water, she gradually understood that her pressure for him to accept the money from the men in suits had stemmed from fear and desperation, not from greed or selfishness. Together, they learned that love truth sometimes demands sacrifices that seem incomprehensible at the moment, but which prove necessary when viewed from the broader perspective of moral responsibility. Sarah's original illness, although serious, proved to be treatable through conventional methods when it was finally diagnosed correctly by specialists who were not limited by the scarce resources of local rural doctors. The treatment would be long and expensive, but the fundraising campaigns organized by Professor William, along with the resources that would eventually come from lawsuits against the polluting companies, ensured that she would receive the necessary care without the family facing financial ruin. During the long nights of vigil by Sarah's side, when she slept under the influence of medications that truly healed instead of just masking symptoms, Michael reflected on how a discovery that had seemed like a divine blessing almost turned into the greatest tragedy Millbrook had ever faced. He had learned, through genuine suffering and difficult moral choices, that sometimes doing the right thing requires sacrificing exactly what we desire most in the world, and that the true cure for life's complex problems rarely comes from miraculous solutions that promise instant results without effort or consequences. The poisoned spring remained sealed, transforming into an involuntary monument to the dangers of corporate greed and environmental negligence. Warning signs were installed around the area, and the cave became part of a broader scientific study on groundwater contamination from abandoned industrial waste. Researchers from distant universities periodically arrived to collect samples and study the long-term ecological effects, transforming that site of personal tragedy into a laboratory for understanding environmental issues affecting rural communities across the country. Gemma, the girl who had drunk the poisoned water believing in its magical powers, became a symbol of the innocence that had been endangered by corporate crimes. Her complete recovery through proper medical treatments inspired the entire community and reinforced Michael's conviction that he had made the right decision by exposing the truth. Seeing that child running through the fields again, this time truly healthy instead of artificially stimulated by toxins, reminded him daily of why he had renounced the fortune offered by the men in suits. The true cure, Michael discovered, was not in miraculous shortcuts or substances that promised instant results, but in the persistent love that had motivated him to seek help for Sarah in the first place, in the courageous moral choices he had made when confronted with temptations that could have destroyed his integrity, and in the community support network that had formed around his family during the most difficult times. Sarah would recover slowly, but with real treatments based on solid science, supported by a community that had learned valuable lessons about trust, responsibility, and the true meanings of healing and hope. The pipeline that had been discovered on her property was completely removed by environmental authorities, along with tons of contaminated soil that were properly treated. The cleanup process took months, but gradually the land began to show signs of health again. Michael planted a small garden at the site, where he had found the first traces of the toxic disposal system, cultivating organic vegetables that symbolized the renewal and redemption of the land that had been ravaged by decades of corporate negligence. The seasons continued to change in the mountains of Kentucky, and with them gradually came the evidence that Michael's moral choices had saved not only the lives of dozens of people, but also the soul of a community that had learned to distinguish between genuine miracles and dangerous illusions. The farmer continued waking up at 4 in the morning to take care of his 3 cows, but now he carried with him the certainty that he had chosen correctly when confronted with the most important decision of his life, and that some victories, even when they cost everything we thought we wanted, are the only ones truly worth achieving. Time had become an ally in Millbrook's journey of collective healing. During the months that followed the revelation of the truth about the poisoned spring, the village gradually developed a new identity based on transparency, mutual responsibility, and the appreciation of both traditional wisdom and modern scientific knowledge. Michael observed this transformation with a mix of pride and melancholy, knowing that it had come at a great cost to everyone involved, but recognizing that it was necessary to build a safer and more honest future for the next generations. The arrival of environmental lawyers had brought with it not only the perspective of legal justice, but also valuable education on community rights and corporate responsibility. Dr. Helena Martinez, an attorney specializing in environmental crimes who had come from Chicago to represent the community, spent several weeks in Millbrook documenting not only the physical damage caused by the contamination, but also the psychological and social impact that the discovery had caused in the small village. "What you have faced here," explained Dr. Martinez during one of the community meetings at the local church, "is a pattern that repeats itself in hundreds of rural communities across the country. Companies dispose of toxic waste in isolated areas, counting on the fact that local communities lack the resources to investigate or contest their actions. You broke that cycle by choosing the truth instead of the bought silence." The subsequent legal battle was complex and lengthy. The company originally responsible for the disposal of the toxic waste had dissolved decades earlier, but its legal responsibilities had been assumed by a larger corporation that tried by all possible legal means to avoid taking blame for the damages caused. For months, corporate lawyers arrived in Millbrook with settlement offers, promising modest financial compensation in exchange for limited admissions of guilt and confidentiality clauses that would prevent the community from speaking publicly about the case. Michael found himself once again at the center of a storm of conflicting pressures. The settlement offers were tempting, especially considering that Sarah would need expensive medical treatments for years, but he had learned to be wary of solutions that seemed too good to be true. With the support of Professor William and Dr. Martinez, the community decided to reject the preliminary agreements and fight for a resolution that included not only adequate financial compensation, but also concrete measures to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in other communities. During this period, Sarah became an eloquent advocate for the rights of victims of environmental crimes. Her personal experience with the deceptive effects of chemical poisoning, combined with her unique perspective as the wife of the man who had discovered and then exposed the contamination, made her a powerful spokesperson for the cause. She traveled to other rural communities, sharing her story and educating people about the warning signs that could indicate hidden environmental pollution. "I learned that true healing does not come from instant miracles," Sarah said during her lectures, her voice still weak but filled with conviction. "It comes from the hard work of facing reality, even when it is painful. It comes from communities that come together to protect each other, even when it means sacrificing personal advantages, and it comes from courageous people who choose the difficult truth over the comfortable lie." The transformation of Mrs. Margaret was particularly remarkable. The healer had initially been devastated to discover that her well-intentioned guidance had led people to a source of poison instead of healing. For weeks, she isolated herself in her home, refusing to attend to people seeking her traditional healing services. It was Sarah who finally convinced her to come out of isolation, arguing that her guilt would be better redeemed through constructive action than through paralyzing self-pity. "The traditional knowledge you carry is valuable," Sarah said during one of her visits to Mrs. Margaret's house. "Margaret, the mistake was not using that knowledge, but using it without questioning, without verifying. Now you can teach others to combine ancestral wisdom with modern verification. This is much more powerful than either one alone." Mrs. Margaret gradually emerged from her depression with a renewed purpose. She established partnerships with regional universities to scientifically study the traditional medicinal plants she had used for decades, contributing both her empirical knowledge and learning about verification methods that could confirm or refute the efficacy of different treatments. Her botanical garden became a respected research center where students of medicine, botany, and anthropology came to learn about the responsible integration between traditional medicine and modern science. Professor William took advantage of the attention the case brought to Millbrook to establish a broader educational program on scientific literacy in rural communities. He wrote academic articles on the importance of teaching critical thinking in areas where access to formal education is limited, and developed curricula that could be implemented in small rural schools throughout the country. His classes at the local school became models of how to teach science in a relevant and accessible way, using local examples to illustrate universal principles. What happened here, William explained to academic visitors who came to study the case of Millbrook, demonstrates both the dangers of scientific ignorance and the power of an educated community to protect itself. We cannot expect rural communities to have access to the same resources as urban centers, but we can teach critical thinking tools that allow people to ask the right questions and seek the right answers. The story of Millbrook began to attract national attention when investigative journalists discovered that the case was part of a much larger pattern of illegal toxic waste disposal in rural communities across the country. Michael found himself being interviewed by reporters from major newspapers and television programs, always reluctant with the attention, but recognizing that his story could help other communities avoid similar tragedies. During a particularly impactful interview, Michael was asked if he regretted exposing the truth about the poisoned well, considering all the difficulties it had brought to his family and community. His response became one of the most remembered quotes from the entire media coverage of the case. "Regret?" he said, his calloused hands resting on his knees as he looked directly into the camera. "How can I regret saving a child's life? How can I regret preventing dozens of people from dying slowly poisoned? The money I refused would have bought temporary comfort, but sleeping knowing that I chose to protect my community gives me a peace that no amount could buy." The legal battle finally reached a resolution 3 years after the initial discovery of the contaminated source. The responsible corporation was required to pay substantial compensation, not only to the direct victims of the contamination, but also to fund long-term environmental monitoring programs and early warning systems that could detect similar pollution in other rural communities. More importantly, the case established legal precedents that made it more difficult for companies to escape responsibility for environmental crimes through strategic corporate dissolutions. Michael used his share of the compensation to transform his property into an environmental education center, where groups of students and activists came to learn about the impacts of industrial pollution on rural communities. The place where he had originally discovered the toxic pipeline became a memorial garden, where plaques explained the history of the contamination and the community's struggle for the truth. Visitors often commented on the poetic irony of a place that had once been a source of poison, transforming into a source of knowledge and inspiration. Sarah continued her medical treatment with progressively positive results. The specialists determined that her original condition was a rare form of autoimmune disease that had been exacerbated by the stress of the family's financial situation and exposure to toxic chemicals. With appropriate treatments and the relief from financial stress provided by legal compensation, she gradually regained not only her physical health, but also a sense of purpose that genuinely and sustainably energized her. The Millbrook community became a model studied by sociologists and environmental activists interested in understanding how small communities can effectively organize to confront corporate threats. The experience had taught the residents that their apparent individual weakness could transform into collective strength when united by clear moral purposes and consistent ethical leadership. Robert Sullivan, the blacksmith who had initially resisted the revelation about the toxic nature of the water, eventually became one of the most eloquent advocates for community transparency. His personal journey from anger and denial to acceptance and constructive action has been documented in various academic studies on how communities process collective trauma and build resilience. "I was angry because the truth destroyed my hope," he explained during one of the regular community meetings, that had become part of Millbrook's new culture. But I learned that hope based on lies is not really hope. It's just a way to avoid facing real problems. True hope comes from knowing that you have the knowledge and the tools to deal with whatever life brings. Emma, the girl who had drunk the poisoned water believing in her magical powers, grew up during those transformative years with a sophisticated understanding of environmental issues and civic responsibility. At 12 years old, she was already speaking eloquently about the importance of questioning claims that seemed too good to be true, and she dreamed of becoming an environmental scientist to help other communities protect themselves from hidden threats. "Mr. Michael saved me," she said during a school presentation about the history of her community. "Not only did he save me from getting sick, but he taught me that brave adults make the right choices, even when it's difficult. When I grow up, I want to be brave like him." The impact of Millbrook's story extended far beyond the borders of the small village in Kentucky. Environmental education programs in schools across the country began to use the case as a case study on the dangers of industrial pollution and the importance of civic participation in environmental protection. Non-governmental organizations developed protocols based on the Millbrook experience to help other rural communities identify and respond to hidden environmental threats. Dr. Martinez, the lawyer who had represented the community, used the success of the case to establish a foundation dedicated to providing free legal assistance to rural communities facing environmental crimes. The Millbrook Foundation, as it became known, trained a new generation of lawyers specializing in environmental justice for underserved communities, creating a national network of legal support for those most vulnerable to corporate environmental crimes. 5 years after the initial discovery of the contaminated source, Millbrook was unrecognizably transformed. What had begun as an impoverished and isolated village had become a regional center for environmental education and community activism. Young people from neighboring communities came to study at the local school, now equipped with advanced science laboratories and innovative sustainability programs. Michael continued waking up at 4 in the morning, but now his herd had grown to 15 cows, and his property included a thriving organic farm that supplied products to regional markets. More importantly, he had found inner peace, knowing that his most difficult choices had been guided by solid moral principles rather than personal convenience. Sarah became a nationally recognized speaker on environmental health issues, her personal story of near poisoning and recovery providing a unique perspective on the human costs of corporate negligence. Her original illness was under complete control through appropriate medical treatments, and she had discovered an inner strength she never knew she possessed during her years of silent suffering. "Sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the greatest curses," Sarah reflected during one of her most emotional speeches. "My illness led my husband to discover a source of poison that was slowly killing our community. Our suffering became the catalyst to save hundreds of people we didn't even know were in danger. The poisoned spring remained sealed, but it became a pilgrimage site for environmental activists and students who came to learn about the hidden dangers of industrial pollution. Educational plaques around the site told the complete story of the discovery, the attempt at corporate silencing, and the courageous moral choice that had saved an entire community. For many visitors, the site became a powerful symbol of how ordinary individuals can confront seemingly invincible corporate forces when guided by clear ethical principles and supported by united communities. Professor William had become a nationally respected figure in rural science education, consulted by politicians and educators on how to improve access to critical thinking in underserved communities. His teaching methods were adapted for use in hundreds of rural schools, and he regularly traveled the country training other teachers on how to integrate relevant science with local community issues. Mrs. Margaret, at 75 years old, had found a new energy in her collaborative research work. Her partnership with universities had resulted in the scientific identification of several genuinely effective medicinal plants, contributing both to medical knowledge and to the validation of responsible traditional practices. Her botanical garden became a model for other similar projects, demonstrating how ancestral knowledge and modern science could work in constructive harmony. "I learned that questioning does not mean disrespect," she explained to students who visited her garden. "Questioning means wanting to understand better. When I started working with scientists, I discovered that they did not want to dismiss my knowledge. They wanted to understand it better and help others benefit from it safely. The transformation of Millbrook had attracted the attention of researchers interested in studying how small communities can adapt and thrive after crises. Sociologists documented how the experience had strengthened community bonds and created a culture of transparency and mutual responsibility that extended far beyond the original environmental issues. The village had developed participatory decision-making systems that ensured important issues were discussed openly before decisions were made. Regular community meetings had become an integral part of life in Millbrook, with high participation and respectful discussions on everything from local infrastructure projects to educational and environmental issues. Michael often reflected on how a discovery that had seemed like a terrible curse had revealed itself, through courageous moral choices and united community action, as an opportunity to build something much better than anyone had imagined possible. The poisoned spring had been sealed, but it had set in motion a stream of positive changes that continued to grow and spread far beyond the original borders of their small community. During the tranquil afternoons, when the day's work was done, and he sat on the porch of his renovated home watching the sunset over the Kentucky mountains, Michael knew with absolute certainty that he had made the right decisions at the most crucial moments of his life. The material wealth he had rejected seemed insignificant compared to the wealth of purpose and community that his choices had made possible. The seasons continued to change in the mountains, bringing with them constant renewal and sustainable growth. Millbrook had become living proof that small communities, when united by solid ethical values and led by people willing to make personal sacrifices for the common good, could not only survive seemingly devastating crises, but emerge from them stronger, wiser, and more prosperous in ways that truly matter. And every morning when Michael woke up at 4 o'clock to start another day of honest work on his restored land, he carried with him the profound satisfaction of knowing that some victories, especially those achieved through difficult moral choices and significant personal sacrifices, create legacies that extend far beyond an individual life, touching and improving the lives of people for future generations.